This afternoon, we are fortunate in having as our host, introducer of the moderator, one of our very distinguished local citizens, a man with a tremendous war record in service in Africa and more especially in China, where he was not only an officer in the American Air Force, but a major general in the Chinese forces. And he has been extremely active. He has done a tremendous job with the Committee of a Million and continues his interest in the affairs in the Far East, but also because of his service in Africa is extremely interested in the Katanga situation. And he has put on a real battle on both those fronts, and it's a great pleasure to have with us this afternoon to introduce our moderator, Colonel W. Ruse Purney from Manchester, Massachusetts.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to present this next gentleman, and who everybody knows without any doubt, and that's to call your attention to Mr. Devin A. Garrity, publisher, and he is head of the Devin Adair books and also a company. He is also very much interested in nature and natural history. And besides having some extremely good books on the situation as it is today, and which we call political books if you want, and just to tell you that at the end of this meeting you can buy these books at a 25% discount right from his table. So it gives me great pleasure just to introduce you immediately a fellow who's got a real bunch of drive and has really put on a grand show, Mr. Devin A. Garrity.
Thank you, Colonel Purney. My reason for asking the Colonel to mention my interest in natural history was done for a peculiar reason, because it gives me an opportunity before introducing the speakers to tell you why I'm a conservative. And I find a great many people who really don't know why they're conservatives. They feel it in their bones, or they're instinctively conservative, but when confounded by liberals, they don't have the answers. Maybe my answer may help one or two here. I'm a conservative because I'm a student of nature. In nature, and that means wild nature and human nature, I find that everything is different. Every individual is different. I do not subscribe to the idea that peas in a pod are alike. Each pea is different. This is a scientifically demonstrable fact that every individual in nature is different from every other individual. Now, if you believe in following nature rather than bucking it, you must believe that nature's laws are correct. And where do you find it possible for individuals to remain different from other individuals, not alike as peas in a pod, better than under the traditional American system? Now, I find this argument works for the liberals. It confounds them for a while. The liberal point of view is just the opposite. It says that all individuals are fundamentally alike. The environment only is different. The only difference between the small African savage child brought up in the Congo and my child, aside from color, which is very obvious, but it's one of environment. And had my child been brought up there, had their child been brought up in my house, the environment, again, would be the only difference. There is no such thing as race, creed, or color differences. There's no such thing as heredity, beyond perhaps the shape of bones, and that we are all fundamentally alike. And their purpose is to see that we are all fundamentally alike. And they are doing that by laws. They are attempting to equalize us. They are doing everything they can to demonstrate their mistaken theory. And of course then I say to them, well, all you fellas, you're the ones that have to go to the psychiatrists. You're the ones that have to find a reason for this, what I consider basic inequality of man. You're inventing something that just is against nature. So you go to the psychiatrist, you try wife after wife, and where does it get you? By this time I find some of them are confused, and I just pass that on to you for what it may be worth. Now, I've been to a number of rallies, and I don't think I've ever been to one where the speaking was more consistently first class. This is... It's been really a thrill. There's been no duplication, and there's been no droning on. You know that story of the man that droned on and on and on at a meeting, and finally someone had the courage to get up and walk out, and then that gave others the idea, and gradually there was a parade until there was only one man left in the front row, and he said, "Sir," he said, "I want to thank you for seeing this through." And the man said, "Don't thank me." He said, "I'm the next speaker." I'm sorry that the people who were here yesterday, all of them, are not here today to hear the two real prize speakers. I consider myself very lucky to be able to introduce these two because of all the ones we've had, and they've all been consistently good and thrilling. I think of these two as a pair that rate in the dessert department. I only know of one occasion before when they appeared, and that was on a very famous broadcast when in April 1961 the CBS decided to take the John Birch Society apart, and they hired what they considered to be some very able opponents of the society. In the case of Dr. Bennett, the head of Union Theological Seminary, and of Senator McGee from Wyoming, good liberal. And opposed to them, they figured they had a man that was on the run, Congressman Rousseau, a first-term congressman. They were about to fix him out there by gerrymandering, and they would get him on so that he could be a marked man. And then who would they get to take the other side, to take the second position? And my friend Brighton Barron, who's here, said that they asked him, and he suggested a man they had never heard of named Tom Anderson. They didn't know what they were getting into. Particularly when they found out he ran a magazine called Farm and Ranch. They thought they had a real hillbilly. So they got him, and evidently the two that you're going to hear today made mincemeat of these fellows, and I don't think they've ever been asked back. First of our speakers, Mr. Tom Anderson, has demonstrated one of the things that I feel very serious about, and that is that not all men are economic cowards. I claim very often that the women of this country are going to save this country because they are not economic cowards. There's so many men who are instinctively conservative or who have reasoned it out and come to the conservative conclusion, but nevertheless they work in an advertising firm or a law firm or a bank, and the accounts have to be taken into consideration, and they keep their mouths shut. So that when you find a man who doesn't do this and lets it work against his own business, then you find a man that I think you can be very proud to know. Now, Tom Anderson, our first speaker, has been a magazine publisher ever since he got out of the investment business in Nashville, Tennessee. His desire has always been, according to his lovely wife, to own the New York Times. he says he'll never be happy until that happens, and he knows it won't happen, so he says he's essentially a sad man, which I doubt. But his magazine, Farm and Ranch, is a magazine that started out with a very large circulation, and Tom had the courage and the guts to follow his conscience and put in editorials that were totally opposed to the Farmers Union philosophy, the New Deal philosophy, and the other philosophies that have led to collectivism on the farm. And he got a lot of opposition, but he stuck to his guns, and the fact that there were cancellations of advertising contracts didn't affect him one iota. He went straight ahead doing exactly as he chose. When the magazine became unprofitable, he realized that perhaps he ought to go into a series of smaller state magazines, and that is what he is now about. He has, I believe, a total of 12. Is it 12? 14. 14. Well, they seem to be growing. Maybe you picked up a couple since you got here. State agricultural magazines, and they seem to be doing quite well. And in each of them, he manages to put the conservative message across when it would be perhaps to his financial advantage not to do so. The left-wing or New Deal type farm magazines are the ones that make a lot of money. I know the Farm Journal down in Philadelphia pretends to be conservative, but when it really comes down to it, they're not going to jeopardize that 1.5 million or 2 million circulation by putting anything in that might be dangerous. So they don't do it. Now, Tom Anderson, in addition to being a man of courage and a man of conviction, who doesn't let money worry him, this is where the dessert comes in. He's a conservative with a very rare sense of humor. And I think that there's no point in stressing this too much, because it's like asking a man to say something funny. But Tom is a treat to listen to, and you're going to hear a man now that I think will have been worth your while coming all the way from California to hear.
Thank you very much, Devin. Thank you very much. Delighted to be in Boston. Thank you. When the extremists who wrote the Declaration of Independence assembled in Philadelphia from over the 13 colonies, the first thing to greet them was an anonymous note found on the speaker's table. It said, "Take care. A plot is framed for your destruction, and all of you shall be destroyed." When the final vote was taken in Independence Hall in Philadelphia on July 4th, every man who signed the Declaration took his life in his hands. If Washington's ragged, outnumbered army could not repulse the British, every signer would be tried for treason to the British crown. Their signatures could, win or lose, mean that their homes could be burned. If Washington lost their wives, their children, their farms would be lost. Have you ever wondered what happened to the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, that this nation under God would not perish from the earth? 5 were captured and tortured by the British. 9 fought and died from wounds or hardships of war. 12 had their homes pillaged and burned. 2 lost their sons in battle. Another had 2 sons captured. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she lay dying. Their 13 children fled for their lives. His mills and fields were laid waste. For more than a year he lived in forests and caves. He returned to find his wife dead and his children vanished. And a few weeks later, he died from heartbreak and exhaustion. Norris and Livingston suffered similar fates. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and properties to pay his debts and died destitute. Vandals and soldiers looted the properties of Ellery, Clymer, Hull, Walton, Goodnett, Haywood, Rutledge, and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson, Jr. urged General Washington to open fire on his, Nelson's, home, which had been taken over by British General Cornwallis for his headquarters. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died broke. Francis Lewis's home was destroyed, and his wife jailed. She died a few months later. Who were these super patriots? Most were young. 18 of them were under 30. They were responsible, religious, family men. These 56 men were the fathers of 325 children. 24 were lawyers and judges. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers. These men whom we call patriots were regarded as radicals by the moderates of their time, who counseled, "Come and let us reason together with the king." They all signed the Declaration of Independence knowing that the penalty would be death if they were captured. They well knew that King George would brand them as traitors, which he did. They knew that they would be tracked down, persecuted, tortured, and killed, which they were. They didn't risk their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor for personal gain. They already had it made. Most of them. They could have played ball with the enemy, like many of our fat cats are doing today, riding what they think is the wave of the future. What is the greatest menace of our country today? Most of our troubles within and without are due to one thing: erosion, not of the soil, but of our national morality. Without morality, freedom cannot survive. Without freedom, morality cannot survive. Our internal problem is not our housing slums, but our moral slums. Our raids on the federal treasury, the cheapening of our money, the legal privileges granted to pressure groups, all are part of moral degeneration. We have fought the wrong wars at the wrong time against the wrong enemies. We have cynically tried to bribe and buy the world as a substitute for a foreign policy, all because we lack morality. It is immoral not to believe in and work for the liberation of the enslaved of the world. Loss of faith in God is our nation's most serious problem. When men lose God, they turn to the state. Thus, they have to destroy God to make communism succeed. Unless we Americans are able to change some of our values, we will lose freedom of choice with respect to life's values. Our forefathers fought, bled, and died to create on this continent the greatest civilization in the history of man, the greatest freedom for the highest percentage of people ever known in human history, the most opportunity, the highest standard of living. And they bequeathed us the greatest freedom document ever devised by man, the Constitution of the United States. This world cannot exist half slave and half free. Which will it be? That depends on us, on America. For if the lamp of freedom is blown out in America, the world will be thrown into darkness. America can save the world if you and I can resurrect just two things: morality and courage. We have all else it takes in superabundance. Only the courageous are moral. Only the moral are courageous. Only the courageous and the moral are free. A prominent Republican is running around the country today, has been, saying in defense of Nelson Rockefeller that a man's private life and public life are two different things. Nuts. A man's private life and public life can't be separated. A man that cheats on his wife cheats on anybody he can. What is this fight all about? If it's just money grubbing, you can count me out. I haven't got time. Our crusade must be for morality. Freedom and morality are indivisible. Typical Americans today eat breakfast over their white tablecloths and pink newspapers and end the day propped up before the boob tubes, which slyly undermine every form of religion, patriotism, decency, and self-reliance. The world watches America, and America watches TV. America, former land of the free and home of the brave. America, a land in which workers get paid for not working, mothers get paid for not marrying, farmers get paid for not farming, and promoters get paid for fertilizer tanks, which ain't. America, where the only God recognized in the classroom is Santa Claus. 2,000 years ago, Plato said the penalty good men pay for indifference of public affairs is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. He was talking about Lyndon Johnson. If you were a communist and you wanted to take this country, how would you do it? They wouldn't dare bomb Washington, New York, San Francisco. They'd kill too many of their own people. You would undermine the church, the family, the schools, and the communication system. Undermine and infiltrate them, and in one generation it would fall like an overripe fruit into your hands. And they are well on the way. A while back I was out in your territory, John. For some reason, made a speech at UCLA. I don't think Gus Hall was available. It was a very responsive audience. They were very sober at my jokes and were hilarious when I talked about morality. And after it was over, the moderator got up and said, just because a person comes here and tells you things which you have never heard before doesn't mean you should ridicule him. And I came away from there thinking, if I thought that represented American youth, and I know it doesn't, I'd quit now. It was the biggest bunch of peg-leg, beatniks, whiskered, dirty trash that I've seen since the people I saw in the line parading for Adlai Stevenson and John Kennedy at the 1960 presidential election. But I know it's not all like that. I was at Bob Jones University a couple of months ago, and I remarked to a couple of people, how do you explain the attitude on this campus? I've never seen such a glow in students' faces. And the answer was, in both cases, they've got religion. So it's not all like that. It is worth saving, and it can be saved. I was in New Orleans 2 or 3 months ago. I happened to be sitting in as a spectator on a TV interview, and the president of one of the largest corporations in the country was being interviewed. And they asked him, what do you think of the wheat sale to Russia? He said, I believe in selling anything to anybody for a profit. And later the interviewer turned to me and said, Mr. Anderson, would you like to comment on the wheat sale to Russia? And I said, yes, I never wanted to comment any worse in my life. This reminds me of Lenin's prediction. The businessman will sell the rope to hang himself with if he can make a profit on it. I think it's immoral, inexcusable, unforgivable. To sell anything to a communist at any time for any price. Ever since that all-American charlatan Franklin D. Roosevelt and his cousin wife Eleanor first lied their way into office for a lifetime, I have been opposing the socialist collectivist conspiracy. And after 30 years, there's one class of Americans for which I have unique contempt, and that is the big businessman. Because he knows better, because he understands economics, because he knows what socialism brings with it, but he goes along riding the tide. Why? Because, like President Johnson, he's amoral. He'll do whatever profiteth him most. The government is his best customer, and he'll do whatever and whenever and to whomever the government dictates. There's an old-fashioned, outdated belief that the top executives of our great corporations, those gargantuan bureaucracies with their seas of dead faces, fragmentized minds, and fossilized hearts, are the most dyed-in-the-wool free enterprisers. Free enterprise and big business are not the same thing. Some of our most dangerous collectivists are the corporate socialists who help manage our planned economy and wax rich off of foreign aid to our enemies. Under a socialist dictatorship, somebody has to run big business. It might as well be they. They reason. Why rock the boat? Why not ride with the wave of the future? When the takeover comes, they'll be the first one shot, and it couldn't happen to nicer folks. Next among my chosen are the so-called society people. They'd be shot first, except they're not important. These people would entertain Khrushchev if he'd promised not to spit the caviar at them. And everybody who's anybody would be at the party. Many socialists claim they are anti-communists. Senator Strom Thurmond, that great Americanist beacon, all that glistens is not gold water, likes to explain the liberal fraud this way, quote, since Marxist socialists share the ultimate goal of the communists, their opposition to communism is limited. These Marxist socialists in our country support anti-communism only so long as it is aimed exclusively at the communist armed threat. They want world socialism controlled by themselves, not the Russians or Chinese. The socialists look forward to an international socialist order just as the communists do, except that they, the socialists, are dedicated to the evolutionary rather than the revolutionary approach. The collectivists pull, sure, communism as it is now practiced is bad, but before we fight it, we have to fight the most pressing evils in our midst: segregation and organized crime, hunger amidst plenty, unemployment, juvenile delinquency. Those same people never argue that these or other evils, real or imaginary, should be fought before we fought Nazism and fascism. Yet there was never a time when Hitler and Mussolini were anything like the menace to the world that communism is today. Why do the liberals hate fascists but not communists? For some people, the breed of the dog determines the ache of the bite. Why are the self-proclaimed liberals so violently opposed to the rightist dictators like Chiang Kai-shek, Batista, and Franco, and so neutral about the dictators of the left like Castro, Tito, Gamaka? Tyranny is tyranny by any name. But whereas Franco is a good, benign dictator, Mao Zedong is guilty of incredible brutalities involving millions of his own people. Mao Zedong, the agrarian reformer, has also murdered more millions than Hitler ever dreamed of. Let it be said in Mao's defense, however, that he looked after them after they were dead. He had their bodies ground up and spread on the land for fertilizer. Hitler was more wasteful. He burned bodies. After our liberal leaders get the United Nations get mail into the United Nations, they will doubtless teach him the error of their ways. He should learn that China's agricultural problem cannot be solved by organic fertilizers. And if we ship him our chemicals as foreign aid, doubtless he will mellow and love us. Guess who wrote this gem? Quote, "A viciously ruthless and corrupt dictator, ethically and politically bankrupt, has been driven from Cuba." Fidel Castro and the young people of Cuba have won a revolution. They have not consolidated it. This may be difficult for them to do. Powerful interests will oppose them. But it should be obvious that Fidel has no intention of going communist. He is a product of Western civilization, nor do the intellectuals and the people about him consider orienting themselves toward Moscow. But it is approved that if this revolution does not succeed, the next one will go far to the left. Therefore, it is to the selfish interest of the United States to do all it can to make this revolution so arduously won a success. A stable Cuba would have a stabilizing effect on all the Caribbean. That is important to us. First, we should recall Ambassador Earl E.T. Smith. He several times referred to the revolutionaries as bandits. This stamps him as a most unobservant man and an ambassador who failed to give his country sound information. The U.S. policy there was damaging. Not only was the ambassador blind to the strength of the Fidel Castro movement, he continued to be very cozy with the Batista crowd. That gem was from the omniscient editor Ralph McGill of the Atlanta Constitution. He wasn't drunk when he wrote it. He was as sober as he can get. The President of the United States awarded McGill and Walter Lippmann, and I don't know anybody who's been wronger than McGill for 30 years, unless it is Walter Lippmann, the Freedom Medal just this week. Castro is an unnecessary evil created in part by the policies of our State Department and by people and institutions like Jack Parr, Ed Sullivan, the New York Times, and Ralph McGill. While McGill was writing that, Robert Welch was saying that Castro was a communist, had been a communist all his adult life, and was under orders from the Kremlin. And everybody said, well, that crackpot. That was in 1958. It was impossible for the fourth floor of the State Department not to have been aware of Fidel Castro's long communist record. Our State Department is like a poison candy bar, a yummy mixture of nuts, fruits, chocolate, and jelly. With artificial coloring and flavoring and a tasteless poison added. The American people must rise up in righteous indignation and demand a congressional investigation of the State Department. Laughing Boy Stevenson tells us that raising the standards of backward countries by sending them American dollars is more important to the United States than our own defense. To Stevenson, everything is. Stevenson is a dead-blooded American boy who's so neutral his blood probably doesn't even have a type. Pitting him against Mao Zedong is like pitting Dagwood against Dick Tracy. Adlai is our head international bugler, and the only tune he can play is Retreat. Like Tennyson's babbling brook, he keeps babbling on. He wants a grand strategy for peace. That's a fancy phrase for surrender. Wonder why he doesn't ask for a grand strategy for freedom. Freedom for all of the enslaved of the world. Why don't we have a Freedom Corps instead of a Peace Corps? Treason, says the dictionary, involves giving aid and comfort to the enemy. In determining what is treason, then, one must decide what is aid and comfort and who is the enemy. Bishop Pike calls segregation treason. The view from Pike's Peak is clouded by unreality. In the realm of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Where does internationalism end and treason begin? We take our sports more seriously than our government. A football coach wins or else, but a Secretary of State can lose every game. And lots of times it's hard to tell which side he's on. Sometimes it's because some of his key players are shaving points, deliberately throwing the game to the enemy. But the Secretary doesn't lose his job, neither do the players nor the CIA coaches. Those who threw Cuba and China and a good deal of the rest of the world's real estate and souls are still in there throwing. The enemy plays chess while we play poker. Their moves are coldly calculated far ahead, and we lose pot after pot because our cards are marked, the deck is stacked, and the dealer is crooked. But we stay in the game. We stay in the game hoping for a lucky draw. Why are we on the brink of socialism, insolvency, and surrender? Treason is the reason. About 10 miles from where I live in Nashville, there's a large and beautifully kept federal cemetery where the Yankee soldiers who fell in the Battle of Nashville are buried. I still remember how, as a small boy, I used to ride by that cemetery with my grandpappy, and he used to look over at those long rows of white markers against the beautiful bluegrass underneath the maple trees and shake his head sadly and say there just ain't near enough of them. Like most Southerners, I grew up wanting to fight the Civil War over. I saw the birth of a nation 4 times, and the 4th time I still couldn't understand how we lost. When I was a boy, chills used to run up and down my spine every time I heard Dixie. And they still do. Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was my number 1 hero, and he still is. It used to irritate me to hear the GIs referred to as Yanks, and it still does. And what's all that got to do with the situation today? Absolutely nothing. I have never voted for the party of my ancestors in a presidential election in my life, and I doubted I'll live long enough to do so. We Southerners like to talk about the conservative South. What conservative South? The South is not conservative. The South is yellow dog Democrat. Many people equate conservatism and segregation. They are not the same thing. Many socialists are segregationists and many conservatives are integrationists. The so-called Civil Rights Bill is a blueprint for dictatorship if there were no such thing as a Negro. It's part of the grand design of the collectivist conspirators for their one world. one race, mongrel, one church, apostate and antichrist, one government under the beast. The one world has proclaimed that segregation is immoral. In our modern one world, they tell us race consciousness shows moral immaturity. Reminds me of the man who divorced his wife because she was so immature. He said, "Why, Judge, she'd even barge into the bathroom while I was in the tub and sink all my boats." Nearly 200 years ago, a British professor named Alexander Fraser Tyler wrote, quote, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can exist only until the voters discover they can vote themselves largest out of the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that democracy always collapses over a loose fiscal policy, always to be followed by a dictatorship." Professor Tyler was writing of the decline and fall of the Athenian Republic over 2,000 years ago, and it is just as true today. This is the law, and the law shall run till the earth in its course stands still, that he that eateth another's bread shall do the other's will. Federal aid is the greatest fraud foisted upon the American people since Franklin D. Roosevelt first ran for president on a conservative platform. We conservatives argue endlessly. We argue too much. Sometimes we remind me of the two preachers who were discussing their religious differences and couldn't get together. And finally, one of them said, "Well, after all, we're both trying to do the Lord's work. You in your way and I in his." We argue about the best methods. Some think the only hope is to stay home and pray, and others want to spend all their time educating, and still others concentrate on politics. God helps those who help themselves. The comrades have murdered millions who were on their knees praying. God alone can save the world, but God won't save the world alone. And neither will it help us to be the best educated slaves in the world. There are 24 hours in the day. Let's spend 8 hours educating, 8 hours politicking, and 8 hours praying. This is a fight in which we will win or lose, live or die. Halfway measures can't win. Many conservatives are now fighting valiantly to cut $1 billion off of foreign aid, or to cut something out of the Civil Rights Bill, or to sell only non-strategic goods to the enemy. Nuts. They say this foot-dragging operation is buying time. Buying time for what? Time to surrender on the installment plan? The comrades want and expect us to buy time. They can't possibly win suddenly. They must win by patient gradualism, the same way they have been winning ever since Franklin D. Roosevelt sold us out in 1933. We continue to buy time while they take the developing nations, after which our time will be up. In the choice between slowing them down and speeding them up, I prefer the latter. Let's have the showdown now. Let's upset both the socialist and the communist timetable by forcing them to take unnecessary chances. The Constitution of the United States is the greatest middle-of-the-road document ever devised for government. We who are trying to preserve and restore constitutional government for America are the real moderates, and those who proclaim, as did President Kennedy and Adlai Stevenson and Senator Fulbright, that the Constitution is an outdated instrument written for an agrarian society and unsuitable for our times, they are the extremists, and all of them who put their right hands on the Bible and swore to uphold the Constitution should be impeached right now. We who oppose the collectivists, who are deliberately delivering us into a socialist, secular, one-world society, are called hate mongers. A Columbia University professor recently stated, quote, 15% of the over-principled population should be encapsulated. This means locked up in a mental hospital, perhaps to be rendered permanently harmless by a free lobotomy. A lobotomy is a permanent don't-care pill administered with a knife. It can even be done under the eyelid without leaving a scar. Remember, it's what's up front that counts. And once you no longer have it up front, you don't care whether your children are being deliberately surrendered to history's most diabolical, God-hating conspiracy. Are you mentally ill? To avoid Siberia, USA, don't fail to side with the administration. The majority is never insane, regardless. Reminds me of the three ladies who were locked up in the nut house, and one said, I wish a man would come by and make love to me, and another said, she ain't gonna be with us long, she's talking sense. Old mountaineer had blessed out his wife the night before for the way she cooked the turnip greens, and as he and his son sat on the porch waiting for Ma to bring in the kindling, as she approached the porch, the son said, Pa, say something about them turnip greens. I loves a row. Well, I love to row with the liberal haters, the foreign and domestic socialists, the Johnson Wheeler dealers, the modern Republicans, do-gooders and defeatists, who say that Barry Goldwater can't beat Johnson. The American people deserve a choice, not an echo. If the Republican Party does not nominate Barry Goldwater, I hope it drops dead. And I think it will. There are three major political parties in this country today: Republican, Democrat, and Supreme Court. I heard a story the other day I'd never heard before. A man who was on the inside said that at the 1952 Republican convention, Taft went into the convention, as you know, with enough votes to win, but Henry Sabotage was screaming fraud, and the Eastern Internationalist kingmakers were seducing the conservatives with the Taft can't win slogan. And while yelling steal, they stole the nomination from Taft, as honest a man as ever lived. Taft had never lost an election, but he was crucified on the cross of expediency. But the interesting part of this story is that there was great pressure on Taft to bow out before their first ballot in favor of Douglas MacArthur. And Taft almost agreed, they say, but he decided that he would wait until the second ballot. And there was no second ballot. And I'm foreseeing that there's no second ballot this time. We know Goldwater. He's got a terrific voting record, one of the best in the United States Senate. We know how he has voted under pressure. Unlike the young bride who was complaining about her husband's drinking, and her mother said, "Well, why in the world did you marry him if you knew he drank so much?" Why, she said, "I didn't know he drank at all until he came home sober one night." Our gifted ex-president, who has received more gifts than all other presidents in history, I believe, Dwight David Eisenhower, is working harder to keep Goldwater from becoming president than Eisenhower ever worked as president. Dwight David Eisenhower is the man who made this remarkable statement, quote, "Nobody is more patriotic than anybody else." A recent news item said that Mr. Eisenhower had always wanted to become a football coach. I'm for that. Although, of course, he's too stupid to be a head coach. It's even been speculated that he might be the vice presidential nominee. It should be apparent to everybody by now that he's not qualified to be vice president. I'm for drafting Eisenhower to do sentry duty at the Berlin Wall, which is his baby. Goldwater is accused of being negative. Some people still consider Paul Revere as an against. He was against the British, but only because he was for freedom. People who believe in and stand up for God, America, and capitalism are called against. And anybody who bitterly opposes our planned merger with the most diabolical conspiracy in human history is a fearmonger. Anyone who actively opposes the liberals' program to make over our country into a socialist labor welfare godless dictatorship is filled with hatred. A conservative friend of mine recently asked the president of a southern university, "Why do you have a continuous stream of liberals across the campus speaking?" Treason had just been there. "Why don't you ever have a conservative?" And the president answered, "If I had a conservative, I would have to have a communist." Now, he wasn't being facetious. This idea has been planted and nurtured that the two extremes are communism and conservatism. Moderation today is socialism. Norman Thomas, Walter Reuther, Lyndon Johnson. The communist conspiracy was termed by Sidney Webb, quote, "the doctrine of the inevitability of gradualness." Webb was one of the founders, with George Bernard Shaw, of the Socialist Fabian Society. Patient gradualism means slow, piecemeal changes in laws, government, morality, economics, and education. Each change is so gradual that there's little or no opposition. The moderates accept it as inevitable change and progress. The Webbs established the London School of Economics, financed by Shaw. This became the center of the socialist movement and attracted such bourgeoisie as John F. Kennedy. Shaw explained an anti-poverty society such as President Johnson proposes like this, quote, "I also made it clear that socialism means equality of income or nothing, and that under socialism you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed, whether you liked it or not. If it were discovered that you had not the character and industry enough to be worth all this trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner. But whilst you were permitted to live, you would have to live well." Close quote. I'm for tragic freedom in preference to compulsory happiness. The comrades want and expect us to buy time. The moderate socialists can neither detect nor defend us from the mainstream of treason. So-called moderates are socialists. Whatever their motives, they spawned this treason. Even an honest, hip-shooting, red-blooded, all-American patriot like Barry Goldwater can't stem the tide, but he's a starter. We'll be saved, not by Barry Goldwater or Strom Thurmond, not from the top down, but from the bottom up, by rebellious patriots. Reassuming on the local level those rights, privileges, taxing powers, and responsibilities guaranteed by the greatest freedom document ever devised by man, the Constitution. And if we at the bottom haven't got what it takes, we don't deserve to survive as a free people. We can't win with lesser of evils. We have to win on principles. That's the reason we've been losing through the years. We haven't stood up and fought, win or lose, for principles. We have been adaptable, like Tricky Dicky Nixon. Hold our wet finger into the wind and vote whatever the polls say. Nixon is adaptable. Like the story about the man who telephoned a couple he hadn't seen in a long time, and the wife answered and he said, "Hi, Mary, how's everything doing? How's old Jim?" "Jim, didn't you know? Jim's dead. He went down to the garden to pull a cabbage and bent over and fell dead right on the spot." "Oh, you poor thing, what in the world did you do?" "Well, what could we do? We had to open a can of peas." When campaigning for the presidency, John Kennedy claimed that 17 million Americans go to bed hungry every night. Now Johnson says 42 million Americans are hungry, but he doesn't say how it happened. And when Lyndon Johnson first started his political career, he had to have a cosigner to swing a $75 bank loan. As secretary to a Texas congressman, LBJ embarked on his Horatio Alger career, making $267 a month, and he's never held a job in private industry since. His wife reportedly inherited an estate with a net worth of $64,332.50. Between them, they are now reportedly worth $10 to $15 million, and I want to know how. It can't be done honestly. Lyndon Johnson, Billy Saul Estes, and Bobby Baker have made more money in less time than any trio since Elizabeth Taylor. One story they're telling about Johnson now depicts him at the pearly gates, and St. Peter excuses himself to go check up on Johnson's credentials. And when he returns, both Johnson and the pearly gates are gone. Mr. Johnson now proposes to take from the haves and give to the have-nots and end all poverty and unemployment in this country. There is no unemployment in Russia. All dictatorships have full employment. They shoot enough people to make the jobs and the people come out even. Now that Johnson has bribed the Civil Rights Bill through, will there be a forced labor bill like other dictatorships have? Once the government has taken over the management and control of all businesses under the Civil Rights Bill, serious imbalances will occur, which will eventually necessitate a completely planned economy, with prices, wages, and all else being dictated from Washington. A government which tells business who to hire will inevitably tell workers where to work. A government powerful enough to wipe out poverty is a government powerful enough to wipe out you. Where there is no poverty, there can be no freedom. A centralized welfare state brings slavery, not freedom. Property rights are the very basis of human rights. The right to self-determination of associates is the essence of human dignity. Forced equality is not democracy, but dictatorship. Forced equality is not freedom, but slavery. Free men are not equal, and equal men are not free. This land of the free was conceived by our founding fathers to preserve the inequalities of its people by a minimum restriction of their liberties. But this land where anybody could be an eagle is forced to become a land in which everybody must become an oyster. Johnson's war on poverty is a blueprint for socialism and dictatorship. You work where, when, how, and for what the government orders, or you get shot. The only place now ever in this world where there is no unemployment will be under a governmental tyranny. It is impossible to have full employment and freedom. As important as the right to get rich is the right to be a bum. As Churchill said, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, you may have to fight when there's no chance of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves. Some people seem to think we have a permanent patent on freedom. Have we become a nation of mental midgets who sold out our freedoms for a mess of pottage? Who have so long shunned our responsibilities as free citizens that we are now trembling weaklings, brainwashed into a self-imposed inferiority complex, happy-pilled into becoming a nation of sheep, ignoramuses, and ostriches, intimidated into a complete lack of faith in our own mental health, lied into accepting what power-mad incompetents say must be? Are we to grovel on our knees before amoral agnostics, avowed atheists, and one-world socialists, merging us into a one world with God-hating tyrants? Are we to surrender our lives, our fortune, our sacred honor, while treason marches on? Let us as a free people vow never to bend to any threat, cower before any master, within or without. God grant that we will live free or die trying. You do as you will. I may die in a dictatorship, but I'm not going to live in one. Thank you.